Liam and Noah were not treasure hunters in the romantic sense. They were underwater scrap merchants who dealt in rust, sludge, and dangerous currents. Their family business, inherited from their father, was on the brink of collapse, battered by a series of failed contracts and rising equipment costs. They needed a miracle. And that miracle appeared in the form of an auction listing for the salvage rights to the MV Meridian. The ship was a mid-sized freighter that had gone down in a storm off the coast of the Azores in 1982. According to the official manifest, the vessel was transporting 3,000 tons of industrial-grade copper wire intended for electrification projects in Europe. Copper prices were at an all-time high, and the math was simple. If they could recover even half of the cargo, they would clear their debts and secure their future for a decade. They pooled their remaining resources, took out a high-interest loan to rent a specialized salvage barge, and bought the rights. It was a gamble that terrified them both, but the allure of the copper was too strong to ignore. The Meridian lay in roughly 120 feet of water, a depth that was accessible but dangerous for prolonged work. The brothers arrived at the coordinates on a gray, choppy morning, the Atlantic Ocean looking unforgiving. After anchoring their barge and setting up the decompression chamber, they suited up. The descent was a silent transition from the chaotic surface world into the crushing, silent blue of the deep. As they lowered themselves down the guideline, the ghostly silhouette of the freighter began to materialize out of the gloom. It was sitting upright on the sandy bottom, its superstructure encrusted with decades of barnacles and soft corals, looking like a sleeping beast. The ship was massive, far larger than it had appeared in the grainy auction photos, and a sense of unease settled over Liam as they touched down on the rusted steel of the deck. Their primary target was cargo hold number 2, where the manifest indicated the bulk of the copper was stored. The hatches were rusted shut, fused by 40 years of saltwater corrosion. They spent the first hour carefully cutting through the massive hinges with an underwater thermal lance, sending clouds of boiling bubbles and molten slag drifting into the current. The work was exhausting, the physical exertion magnified by the pressure and the resistance of the water. When the final hinge gave way, they attached a lift bag to the heavy steel cover and inflated it. The hatch groaned, a sound that vibrated through the water and into their chests before slowly creaking open, revealing the yawning, pitch-black throat of the cargo hold. They floated above the opening for a moment, shining their lights into the abyss before descending into the belly of the ship. Hey guys, we are going to take a very quick pause here because the suspense of entering this ship is killing us too. We are incredibly close to hitting our goal of 10 subscribers, and we need your help to cross that finish line. If you are enjoying this deep sea mystery, please smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a discovery. It supports the channel massively. Also, if you want to support our storytelling directly, check out the Super Thanks button below. It helps us create more complex stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you diving into this video from? We love seeing our global crew. Now, let's get back into the hold of the Meridian. Inside the hold, visibility dropped to near zero as the silt from their entry swirled around them. They waited, suspended in the dark, breathing rhythmically until the water cleared. As the particles settled, their powerful helmet lights cut through the darkness, revealing the prize. Stacked floor to ceiling were thousands of massive spools of copper wire. The sheer volume was breathtaking. Even with the heavy oxidation turning the metal a dull green, the potential value sitting in that hold was staggering. They had done it. They had found the mother lode. Noah signaled a thumbs up, his relief palpable even through the thick diving suit. They swam toward the nearest stack, intending to inspect the quality of the wire. However, as they moved deeper into the hold, navigating the narrow canyons between the towering spools, something felt wrong. The stacking pattern was unusual. Cargo ships usually packed heavy materials low and distributed for balance, but these spools were arranged in a dense wall-like formation, creating a perimeter around the center of the hold. It felt less like storage and more like a barricade. Liam swam up to one of the spools and wiped away the layer of marine growth. The wire was thick, high-gauge industrial cable, exactly as the manifest described. But when he tried to shift the spool to check the one behind it, it didn't budge. It wasn't just heavy, it was welded to the deck. Confused, Liam signaled Noah to come closer. They inspected the base of the stack. Heavy steel brackets had been welded to the floor plates, locking the copper spools in place. This was not standard shipping procedure. Securing cargo was normal, but welding it to the ship's structure was permanent. It implied that this cargo was never meant to be offloaded quickly, or perhaps it was meant to serve as a shield. Driven by a sudden spike of curiosity and suspicion, the brothers decided to bypass the outer rows. They swam over the top of the stacks, squeezing through the small gap between the cargo and the overhead deck beams. Dropping down into the center of the hold, they found themselves in a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The copper spools formed a perfect square, walling off a space in the middle of the ship. In the center of this clearing sat a large rectangular structure draped in heavy, rotting canvas. It was roughly the size of a shipping container, but shaped differently with reinforced angles. The manifest had mentioned copper and nothing else. There was no record of a secondary cargo, let alone something this large and deliberately concealed, protected by a fortress of copper. Liam approached the object, his heart pounding against his ribs. He pulled out his dive knife and carefully sliced the securing ropes of the canvas. The fabric, heavy with water and age, sloughed off in slow motion, revealing a dull, gray metal surface underneath. It wasn't a standard container. It was a custom-fabricated steel module, completely smooth, with no visible handles or hinges on the side facing them. It looked like a military-grade bunker dropped into the hull of a merchant ship. They swam around to the front and found a heavy, circular airlock-style door, sealed tight with a wheel that looked frozen in time. Stenciled across the metal and faded yellow paint were letters that sent a chill through Liam. U.S. Naval Research Lab. Authenticated personnel only. The brothers looked at each other. They had bought a scrap ship for copper, but they had stumbled upon a classified relic of the Cold War. The copper was real, but it was just the packaging. The real cargo was inside this watertight citadel. They weren't just salvagers anymore. They were trespassers on a secret that had been sitting in the dark for 40 years. They knew they couldn't open it underwater. The pressure differential or water damage could destroy whatever was inside. They had to make a choice. Take the copper and leave, or risk everything to salvage the module intact. The module was massive, likely weighing tons. Raising it would require heavy lift balloons and a level of engineering they hadn't planned for. But the mystery was a siren song. They decided to inspect the door closer. Liam wiped the silt from a small, thick glass viewport in the center of the steel door. He pressed his face mask against the glass and shone his light inside. The beam cut through the dry, preserved air of the module. What he saw made him gasp, expelling a burst of bubbles. Inside, racks of metallic silver cases were lined up, gleaming under his light, untouched by the ocean. The ascent to the surface was agonizingly slow, a forced meditation imposed by the laws of physics. As Liam and Noah hung on the decompression line, watching the bubbles spiral upward toward the shimmering ceiling of the Atlantic, their minds were racing far faster than their bodies were allowed to move. The image of the sealed module, with its official government stenciling and the glimpse of silver cases, burned in their memories. They had come for copper, a simple commodity with a fluctuating market price. But they had found an anomaly that defied explanation. The Meridian wasn't just a casualty of bad weather. It was a grave for a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. When they finally broke the surface and climbed onto the rusting deck of their salvage barge, the Iron Mule, the gravity of the situation hit them with the fresh sea air. They didn't speak immediately. They simply sat on the gunnels, stripping off their heavy gear, the adrenaline crash leaving their hands trembling. Once they were out of their suits and huddled in the barge's small heated cabin with mugs of coffee, the brothers formulated a plan. They couldn't just yank the module out. It was trapped behind walls of copper that weighed hundreds of tons. Furthermore, the module was welded to the keel, meaning it was a structural component of the wreck. To get to the prize, they had to do the job they came for: salvage the copper. It was a blessing in disguise. The sale of the copper wire would fund the specialized equipment, cutting torches, larger lift bags, and a stronger crane, needed to extract the module. They decided to treat the operation as standard salvage on the surface, keeping the discovery of the citadel, as they began to call it, a strict secret between them. They established a rotation: 12 hours of cutting and lifting, 12 hours of rest, maximizing the daylight in the calmer weather windows. The next 3 weeks were a blur of grueling industrial labor. The brothers descended daily into the gloom of cargo hold number 2. The work was brutal. They used hydraulic cutters to shear through the heavy steel brackets holding the copper spools. Each spool, weighing nearly 2 tons, had to be individually rigged with lift bags, inflated just enough to make them neutrally buoyant, and then guided out of the hold to the waiting crane cable. It was a dangerous dance with heavy metal in a weightless environment. One slip, one snapped cable, and a diver could be crushed instantly. As they cleared the outer rows, the barge's deck began to fill with the green oxidized wire, a mounting fortune that guaranteed their business would survive. Yet, with every spool removed, the citadel in the center became more exposed, standing like a monolith in the clearing. During the removal of the final row of copper shielding the module's port side, Noah noticed something that chilled his blood. He was cutting a bracket near the hull plating when his light caught the edge of a jagged tear in the ship's steel skin. He waved Liam over. The damage wasn't from hitting the seafloor, nor was it the chaotic twisting of metal caused by a storm. The steel plates were bent inward, the edges fused and curled as if subjected to extreme, concentrated heat and force. It was a blast hole, a perfectly placed detonation below the waterline, right next to where the classified module was secured. The realization shifted the narrative entirely. The Meridian hadn't sunk by accident. It had been targeted. Someone had tried to sink this specific cargo, or perhaps prevent it from reaching its destination. The brothers were now tampering with a crime scene from the Cold War. Fear began to creep into the operation, but greed and curiosity were powerful antidotes. They had cleared the copper. The module stood alone in the center of the hold, a gray steel box anchored to the ship's ribs. It was time for the main event. They returned to the surface and reconfigured the barge's heavy lift winch. They constructed a custom lifting harness using heavy chains and steel straps, designed to cradle the module. The weather forecast warned of a developing low-pressure system, giving them a narrow window of 48 hours before the ocean would become too rough to work. It was now or never. The final dive to rig the Citadel was the most tense of their careers. The hold, now empty of copper, felt cavernous and spooky. The silt stirred up by their movements cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. They worked in silence, wrapping the chains around the module's reinforced corners. The hardest part was cutting the floor bolts. These weren't standard bolts. They were thick, military-grade anchors. Liam used the thermal lance, the white-hot magnesium flame burning fiercely underwater, slicing through the steel while Noah kept a fire hose trained on the area to disperse the clouds of boiling water and molten slag. It took 4 hours of continuous cutting until the module groaned, shifting slightly as the ship released its grip. They inflated 4 massive lift bags attached to the harness, providing thousands of pounds of upward thrust to assist the crane. Liam gave the signal to the surface crew, which was just an automated winch system they monitored remotely, and the cable went taut. The module shuddered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed stuck, the suction of the mud and the weight of the water holding it down. Then, with a deep, grinding screech of tearing metal, it broke free. The brothers kicked their fins, backing away rapidly to avoid the wash as the massive steel box began its slow, majestic ascent toward the surface, looking like a monolith rising from the deep. Topside, the iron mule listed heavily as the crane took the full weight. The brothers surfaced and scrambled onto the barge, watching the water churn. The winch whined in protest, the cable singing with tension. Slowly, the gray, barnacle-encrusted roof of the Citadel breached the surface, water cascading off its sides like a waterfall. They swung it over the deck and lowered it with a heavy thud that shook the entire vessel. It sat there, dripping and ominous, an alien object amidst the piles of scrap copper. The U.S. Naval Research Lab stencil was now clearly visible in the sunlight, looking stark and forbidding. They wasted no time. The weather was turning, the sky was bruising a purple in the east. They had to know what was inside before they headed back to port. Liam grabbed an angle grinder while Noah set up a portable generator. The wheel on the airlock door was seized solid by corrosion. They couldn't turn it. They had to cut the locking pins. Sparks showered the deck as Liam attacked the hinges. It took 20 minutes of aggressive cutting before the metal gave way. They used a crowbar to pry the heavy steel door. It hissed, a long, sharp intake of air, indicating that the seal had held perfectly for 40 years. The pressure inside had been lower than the atmosphere outside. They swung the heavy door open. The air that drifted out didn't smell like the ocean. It smelled stale, metallic, and faintly of ozone and machine oil. It was the air of 1982. Liam clicked on his flashlight and stepped into the cramped interior. The module was dry. The beam of light swept over the interior, revealing it was not a living space, but a secure transport locker. The walls were lined with shock-mounted racks, holding 6 large, heavy-duty aluminum cases, each looking brand new, contrasting sharply with the rusty exterior. There were no papers, no manifests, just the cases. Noah stepped in behind him, his heart hammering. He reached for the nearest case. It was latched with heavy-duty hasps, but not locked with a key. It was secured with a tamper-evident lead seal. He twisted the seal until it snapped. He undid the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, resting in custom-cut, high-density black foam, was not a weapon, nor gold bars. It was a series of heavy, translucent glass cylinders, each capped with stainless steel. Inside the glass, suspended in a clear, viscous gel, were metallic, geometric rods that shimmered with an iridescent, rainbow-like luster. They looked like fuel rods, but unlike anything the brothers had ever seen in standard nuclear diagrams. Beneath the cylinders was a metal plate etched with technical data. Liam wiped the dust off the plate and read the engraving. Project Helios, Photovoltaic Amplification Matrix. MAT-T, Refined Iridium Osmium Alloy, Prototype Class. He looked at Noah, his eyes wide. They weren't looking at nuclear waste. They were looking at a massive quantity of iridium and osmium, 2 of the rarest and densest elements on Earth, engineered into a technology that likely never saw the light of day. The raw material value alone in just one case was astronomical. But as they marveled at the shimmering rods, a heavy thud echoed from outside the barge. Another boat had just slammed against their hull. They weren't alone on the ocean anymore. The impact against the hull reverberated through the steel deck of the Iron Mule like a gong, instantly shattering the moment of discovery. Liam and Noah froze, the iridescent glow of the iridium rods reflecting in their wide eyes. They were miles offshore, drifting in a developing storm in a sector of the ocean that should have been empty. The collision wasn't the drift of debris, it was the aggressive docking of another vessel. Liam reacted first, slamming the lid of the high-tech case shut and throwing the heavy canvas tarp back over the open door of the Citadel. Noah killed the deck lights, plunging the barge into the gray twilight of the approaching squall, leaving only the navigation beacons blinking rhythmically. They grabbed the nearest tools, heavy steel crowbars used for leverage, and stepped out from behind the shelter of the raised module to face the intruders. Bobbing violently in the chop alongside their barge was a sleek, matte black, rigid-hulled inflatable boat, a military-grade interceptor powered by twin high-output outboard motors that rumbled with a deep, menacing idle. There were no running lights, no registration numbers, and no flags. Standing in the center of the craft were three figures clad in dark gray, waterproof tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas and ballistic goggles. This was not the Coast Guard, and it certainly wasn't a casual pleasure cruiser. These were professionals, moving with the calculated efficiency of a strike team. The lead figure, a man of imposing height, stood with one boot already on the barge's rub rail, a heavy coil of rope in his hand, preparing to board without permission. The confrontation was silent and tense, played out over the roar of the wind and the crashing waves. The brothers stood at the gunwale, blocking the boarding point, their crowbars held ready. They were salvagers, hardened by years of dangerous physical labor, and they didn't look like easy targets. The lead intruder paused, assessing the situation. He gestured towards the massive shape of the Citadel looming in the shadows behind the brothers, ignoring the mountains of valuable copper wire entirely. His focus confirmed the brothers' worst fear. The copper was invisible to these men. They were here for the module. The intruder made a calm, circular hand motion, indicating the brothers should step aside, his other hand resting casually near his waist, suggesting a concealed weapon. The situation was balanced on a knife edge when the ocean intervened. The low-pressure system that had been threatening the horizon finally broke over them with sudden violence. A massive rogue swell driven by the increasing gale slammed into the side of the barge. The iron mule, heavy and stable, lurched sickeningly, but the smaller interceptor boat was tossed like a toy. The lead boarder lost his footing, nearly pitching into the churning gap between the two steel hulls. The fiberglass of the interceptor crunched against the barge's heavy rub rail, a sound of expensive damage that caused the driver of the boat to shout and gun the engines in reverse to save their vessel. The gap widened instantly as the interceptor was dragged away by the current and the wind. The lead figure, regaining his balance in the boat, stared at Liam with a look of cold, promised violence, pointing a gloved finger at the Citadel before the boat peeled away, disappearing into the wall of rain and darkness. They weren't retreating, they were regrouping, likely unable to board safely in the escalating swells. Adrenaline dumped into the brothers' systems, leaving them shaking. They knew the reprieve was temporary. The interceptor couldn't board in this weather, but they could shadow the slow-moving barge or radio for a larger vessel. Liam ran to the wheelhouse and slammed the throttle of the iron mule forward, aiming the bow toward the coast, but not toward their home port. Going home would lead the wolves right to their doorstep. Instead, he plotted a course for Black Rock Cove, a derelict natural harbor surrounded by high cliffs, used decades ago by smugglers and now abandoned. It was a navigational nightmare, filled with jagged, submerged rocks, but it was the only place where they could hide the barge from radar and visual scanning. As Noah secured the loose equipment on the deck, battling the lashing rain, Liam kept the barge plowing through the waves. The Iron Mule was a tough vessel, but she was slow. They had hours of travel ahead of them. Once the immediate chaos of the storm routine settled, Noah returned to the Citadel. The intruder's interest had confirmed the contents were not just valuable, but critical. He slipped back inside the steel module, wedging the door shut with a block of wood from the inside, and turned on his tactical light to inspect the rest of the cargo. He needed to understand what they were dying for. He opened the remaining 5 cases. The second and third contained more of the iridium osmium rods, enough raw material to power a small city or build a devastating weapon, depending on the application. The fourth case, however, was different. It didn't contain rods. It was lined with complex, shock-absorbing electronics and a control interface that looked like it belonged in a spacecraft. In the center was a slot, clearly designed to accept one of the rods. This was the activation device, the hardware designed to utilize the fuel. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond the standard manufacturing of the 1980s. It was a black project, technology developed in total secrecy, likely decades ahead of its time, then lost when the Meridian went down. The fifth case was the most disturbing. When Noah undid the latches, he found the foam insert torn. The slot in the foam was shaped for a distinct spherical object, about the size of a grapefruit, but the space was empty. Unlike the pristine condition of the other cases, this one showed signs of hasty interference. There were greasy fingerprints on the foam, old and dark. Someone had opened this case before the ship sank. The realization hit Noah hard. The blast hole in the hull, the sunk ship, the welded copper fortress. It was all a containment measure, but the sabotage had happened from the inside. Someone had stolen the core, whatever the spherical object was, and then scuttled the ship to hide the theft, or perhaps the ship was sunk to prevent the thief from escaping. He moved to the final, sixth case. It was smaller, a flat briefcase-style box made of heavy steel. It was locked with a combination dial. Noah didn't have the code, but the hinges were exposed on the back. He used a heavy screwdriver to pop the pins. Inside was not hardware, but paperwork. These were the original project files. The cover sheet was stamped Top Secret No Foreign Nationals, and bore the logo of a defense contractor that didn't technically exist in public records. Ethelgard Dynamics. The documents described Project Helios not as a power source, but as a directed energy amplification system. The rods were focusing lenses for a satellite-based weapon system intended to disable Soviet ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere. The core that was missing was the encryption key and the primary power initiator. Without it, the rods were just expensive metal. With it, the system was a superweapon. Noah rushed to the wheelhouse to show Liam the documents. The gravity of their situation shifted from financial opportunity to national security crisis. They were in possession of a dormant Cold War superweapons components. The men in the black boat weren't just pirates. They were likely the cleanup crew for Ethelgard Dynamics, or a foreign entity that knew the Meridian had been found. The brothers realized they had three problems: the storm battering their barge, the mercenaries hunting them, and the missing core, which was likely still somewhere on the wreck of the Meridian. Or worse, it had been taken by the traitor 40 years ago and was the reason the ship was destroyed. As the Iron Mule limped into the mouth of Black Rock Cove, the sonar alarm pinged. The water here was shallow and treacherous. Liam killed the engines, letting the barge drift silently on the momentum, guiding it between the towering rock spires that hid the cove from the open sea. They dropped the anchor in the murky calm of the hidden bay. They were safe from the storm and hidden from sight, but they were trapped. They couldn't go to the authorities. The government would confiscate the copper and likely imprison them for possessing classified materials, or worse, disappear them to keep the secret. They couldn't sell the rods. They were too unique. Their only leverage was the information they now held. Then, Noah noticed something on the back of the Project Helios file. It was a handwritten note, scribbled in the margin of the manifest in fading blue ink. It was a set of coordinates, different from where they found the ship, and a name, Subject 0. The handwriting matched the frantic scribbles in the margins of the technical diagrams, likely from the scientist or officer who sabotaged the shipment. The note suggested the missing core wasn't taken off the ship. It was jettisoned separately or hidden elsewhere. The brothers looked at each other. To survive, they needed the whole package. If they found the core, they would have the ultimate bargaining chip. But to get it, they had to go back to the water, not at the wreck site, but at the coordinates of the Subject 0. And they had to do it before the men in black found them. Black Rock Cove provided a temporary sanctuary, the towering basalt cliffs shielding the Iron Mule from the worst of the gale and, more importantly, from the radar of the hunting party. Liam and Noah spent the first hour in a frenzy of camouflage, draping the bright orange superstructure of the crane and the gray bulk of the citadel with heavy fishing nets and drab canvas tarps. To any passing aircraft or satellite sweep, the barge would now look like a pile of derelict debris washed up against the rocks, a common sight on this rugged coastline. Once the vessel was secured, the brothers retreated to the wheelhouse, the only source of light a red tactical lamp to preserve their night vision. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of wet wool and anxiety. They were safe for the moment, but they were trapped. The mercenaries knew the Meridian had been salvaged. It was only a matter of time before they began a grid search of the coastline. Noah spread the Project Helios documents and the navigational charts across the chart table. He focused intensely on the handwritten coordinates labeled Subject 0. Plotting the latitude and longitude, his finger traced a line away from the wreck site of the Meridian, moving 5 miles south to a geological feature known as the Devil's Drop. It was a steep underwater shelf where the continental plate fractured, dropping abruptly from a manageable 150 feet into a crushing abyss of over 2,000. The coordinates pinpointed a location right on the lip of this precipice. The implication was clear. Whoever had stolen the core and sabotaged the ship hadn't gone down with the wreck. They had attempted to flee, likely in a lifeboat or escape pod, but had failed to reach safety, coming to rest precariously on the edge of the deep. The brothers faced a critical decision. They couldn't take the slow, lumbering barge to the Devil's Drop. It would be a sitting duck in open water. They had to leave their fortune, the barge, the copper, and the citadel, hidden in the cove, and make a surgical strike using their fast scout boat, a 20-foot rigid inflatable attached to the stern. It was a terrifying gamble. If the mercenaries found the barge while they were gone, they would lose everything. If the mercenaries found them on the open water, they would lose their lives. But without the core, the citadel was just a target on their backs. They needed the leverage. They decided to move immediately, using the cover of the storm's tail end to mask their acoustic signature. Preparation for this dive was different. They shed their heavy surface-supplied commercial diving gear, which tethered them to the boat with umbilical hoses. This mission required speed and stealth. They opted for technical scuba configurations with rebreathers. These advanced systems scrubbed carbon dioxide from their exhalation and recycled the gas, meaning they would release no bubbles into the water. Bubbles were a dead giveaway to surface observers and sonar. Clad in black neoprene dry suits and armed with dive knives and high-power underwater torches, they loaded the scout boat. They sped out of the cove, the small vessel slamming punishingly against the residual swell, running dark with no navigation lights, guided only by the glowing green screen of their GPS. Arriving at the coordinates, the ocean was an inky void. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, rolling swell that lifted and dropped the small boat in nauseating cycles. They killed the engine and threw a sea anchor to hold their position. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the wind. They performed a final equipment check, the unspoken bond of brotherhood, serving as their only communication, and rolled backward over the gunnels, slipping silently into the freezing Atlantic. The descent was eerie. Without the umbilical tether, they felt untethered from reality. They dropped through the water column, their lights switched off for the first 50 feet to avoid detection from the surface. At 80 feet, they turned on their beams. The water here was clearer than at the Meridian site, the current sweeping away the silt. Below them, the beam caught the jagged, rocky edge of the Devil's Drop. It looked like the end of the world, a sharp cliff edge that fell away into infinite darkness. And there, teetering precariously on a rock outcropping just 10 feet from the vertical drop, was the object. It wasn't a standard lifeboat. It was a sphere, roughly 6 feet in diameter, constructed from the same dull gray reinforced steel as the Citadel. It was an escape pod, a prototype escape vessel designed for high-value personnel. It had clearly impacted the seabed with tremendous force. One side of the sphere was crumpled like tin foil, and the thick glass viewport was shattered. It was a tomb. The brothers approached carefully, fighting the strong down current that threatened to sweep them over the edge of the drop. Liam secured a safety line to a rock spire and clipped it to Noah's harness. If the pod shifted, it would slide into the abyss, and they couldn't risk going with it. Noah swam to the shattered viewport and shone his light inside. The interior was a grim time capsule. Strapped into the pilot's seat were the skeletal remains of a man, still wearing the tattered remnants of a 1980s naval officer's uniform. The skull, lolled forward, held in place by the rotting straps. This was likely the traitor, the man who had tried to steal the future and ended up dying alone in the dark. But Noah's eyes were drawn to what was in the skeleton's lap. The bony hands were still clutching a heavy, shock-proof Pelican-style case, shackled to the officer's wrist with a steel handcuff. They had found it, the core. Entering the crushed sphere was impossible. The opening was too small. They had to extract the case from the outside. Liam used a hydraulic spreader tool they had brought, inserting the jaws into the shattered viewport frame. He pumped the handle, the metal groaning and screeching as the frame expanded. Noah reached in, his arm scraping against the jagged metal. He grabbed the handle of the case, but the handcuff held fast. He had to use bolt cutters to snap the rusty chain connecting the case to the dead man's wrist. It was a macabre, disrespectful act, but necessary. As the chain snapped, the skeleton shifted, disturbed after 40 years of stillness, and for a heart-stopping second, the entire sphere lurched, grinding against the rock. Liam grabbed Noah's tank valve and yanked him back just as the sphere tipped. They watched in breathless silence as the steel tomb slid slowly, then rapidly, over the edge of the cliff. It tumbled into the darkness of the Devil's Drop, vanishing forever into the deep, taking its pilot to the bottom of the trench. They were left floating in the silence, the precious case gripped tightly in Noah's hand. They had the core. They had the missing piece of the superweapon, but the victory was short-lived. As they turned to begin their ascent, a strange sound vibrated through the water, a high-pitched electronic whine. It wasn't a boat engine. It was distinct, mechanical, and getting louder. Liam spun around, aiming his light into the gloom. Emerging from the darkness, like a predatory deep-sea shark, was a remote-operated vehicle, ROV. It was sleek, yellow, and emblazoned with the same Ethelgard Dynamics logo as the documents. It hummed with thrusters, its camera lenses adjusting like eyes. The mercenaries hadn't found the brothers. They had been scanning the likely escape routes of the saboteur with drones. The ROV stopped, hovering 20 feet away. Its spotlight blinded them. Then, a manipulator arm extended from its undercarriage. It wasn't just a camera. It was a work-class ROV capable of cutting cables and grabbing objects. The drone operator on the surface now saw two divers in the case. The brothers were exposed. The drone surged forward, its mechanical claw opening aggressively, aiming not for the brothers, but for the air hoses on their rebreathers. The operator intended to disable them or panic them into dropping the case. Liam reacted on instinct. He didn't have a weapon, but he had the hydraulic spreader tool still in his hand. He kicked his fins, propelling himself violently toward the machine. The ROV tried to strafe, but Liam was faster. He jammed the heavy steel jaws of the spreader into the ROV's exposed thruster propeller. There was a crunch of plastic and metal, and the whine turned into a dying grind. The ROV spun uncontrollably, its tether tangling. Noah seized the moment, grabbing Liam's harness and signaling frantically for the surface. They had blinded the eyes of the enemy, but now the enemy knew exactly where they were. The surface was no longer a safe haven, it was a trap. They had to ascend, but they knew that the moment their heads broke the water, the men in the black boat would be waiting. They were coming up with the most dangerous object on the planet, right into the crosshairs of a kill team. The ascent from the Devil's Drop was a desperate race against physiology and firepower. Liam and Noah, abandoning the slow, safe ascent rates required to prevent decompression sickness, kicked wildly for the surface. Their dive computers screamed warnings, flashing red alarms that they were rising too fast, risking the bends, but the alternative was death by the mercenaries waiting above. The water around them vibrated with the heavy thrum of the enemy vessel's engines, the sound amplifying as they got shallower. They couldn't surface directly at their scout boat. The enemy would be watching it. Instead, Liam signaled a vector toward the jagged base of a sea stack, a tower of rock protruding from the ocean 50 yards from their boat. They needed cover before they broke the surface tension. They breached the water in the shadow of the rock, gasping for real air, tearing the regulator mouthpieces from their jaws. The scene was chaotic. The storm had passed, but the sea was still heaving with dark, oily swells. 100 yards away, the sleek black interceptor boat was circling their empty scout craft like a shark. A powerful spotlight swept the water, searching for the bubbles they hadn't made thanks to the rebreathers. The ROV tether trailed from the stern of the enemy boat, taut and angling down into the depths where they had just destroyed the drone. The mercenaries knew the brothers were down there, but they didn't know they had already surfaced behind them. With the noise of the enemy engines masking their movements, the brothers swam furiously toward their scout boat. They reached the rubber gunnel just as the spotlight began to swing back in their direction. Liam hauled himself over the side, adrenaline giving him the strength of 10 men, and dragged Noah and the heavy case containing the core into the floor of the boat. He didn't bother with the anchor. He slashed the rope with his dive knife. He slammed the throttle forward just as the spotlight hit them. The sudden roar of their outboard motor was answered instantly by the crack of automatic gunfire. Bullets zipped through the air, slapping the water around them and punching into the rubber tubing of their boat. Liam crouched low behind the center console, steering with one hand, navigating by pure instinct and the memory of the coastline. The chase was on. Their scout boat was fast, but the military interceptor was faster. It roared to life, turning in a tight arc and accelerating with terrifying speed. The brothers were skipping across the waves, the hull slamming violently against the water, threatening to throw them overboard. Noah lay flat on the deck, his body curled around the Pelican case, shielding the core with his life. He looked back. The interceptor was gaining, its bow cutting through the chop, muzzle flashes sparking from the deck as the mercenaries fired to disable their engine. They were 5 miles from the safety of Black Rock Cove. In open water, they were dead men. Liam knew their only chance lay in the grinder, a treacherous stretch of shallow reefs and submerged granite needles that guarded the approach to the cove. It was a suicide run for anyone who didn't know the exact channel, but it was the only way to shake a larger vessel. He banked the boat hard left, heading straight for a line of breaking white water that signaled shallow rocks. The interceptor followed, the pilot likely assuming the brothers were panicking. As they hit the white water, Liam killed the throttle for a split second to drift over a submerged ridge, then gunned it again. The interceptor, heavier and deeper in the draft, didn't have the same agility. The brothers heard a sickening metallic crunch of fiberglass grinding on granite behind them. The enemy boat lurched violently, its engine screaming as the propellers cavitated in the foam. It didn't stop them completely, but it slowed them down. Smoke began to pour from the interceptor's stern, but the mercenaries were relentless. They launched a smaller, lighter skiff from the back of their damaged vessel. 2 men boarded it, continuing the pursuit into the shallow maze. The brothers tore into the calm waters of Black Rock Cove, the iron mule looming like a fortress in the shadows. They didn't slow down until they were practically alongside the barge. They scrambled up the ladder, hauling the case onto the steel deck. They were home, but the siege was just beginning. The skiff was minutes behind them, navigating the channel. Liam ran to the wheelhouse to grab the flare gun and a shotgun they kept for sharks, while Noah sprinted to the citadel. The massive steel module was still sitting there, stripped of its camouflage by the wind. Noah keyed the combination into the lock of the citadel's door, which they had secured earlier. He threw it open and rushed inside, placing the Pelican case on the floor. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely undo the latches. He pulled out the core, a heavy, metallic sphere pulsating with a faint, rhythmic heat. He moved to the central control console, the fourth case they had opened earlier. The slot in the center of the complex machinery was waiting. He hesitated. They had no idea what this machine actually did. The document said directed energy amplification, but that was theoretical physics on paper. In reality, it could be a bomb, a beacon, or a generator. But with armed mercenaries closing in to kill them, unknown sci-fi technology was their only card left to play. He slotted the core into the console. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The moment the sphere clicked into place, the Citadel didn't just turn on, it woke up. A deep, sub-bass thrum resonated through the steel floor of the module, vibrating through Noah's boots and into his chest. The iridium-osmium rods in the other cases began to glow with a blinding, ultraviolet intensity, vibrating in their suspension gel. The ambient light in the cove seemed to dim as the machine drew power from the very air, or perhaps from the static of the lingering storm. The hum grew louder, a rising turbine whine that set the brothers' teeth on edge. Outside, Liam watched as the enemy skiff cleared the final rock and sped toward the barge. The two mercenaries raised their weapons, preparing to board. But then the Citadel activated. The air around the Iron Mule crackled with static electricity. The hair on Liam's arm stood up. The mercenaries in the skiff froze, looking up at the barge. The massive steel box of the Citadel was now emitting a visible distortion field, ripples of heat or energy shimmering in the air around it. The electronics on the enemy skiff, the GPS, the engine ignition, the radios, sparked and died instantly. The outboard motor cut out, leaving them drifting in silence. Noah watched the console inside. Needles on the analog gauges buried themselves in the red. A radar screen, which he hadn't noticed before, flickered to life, showing a 360-degree sweep of the area. It wasn't just a power source, it was a defensive system. The amplification matrix was gathering ambient energy and focusing it. He realized with a jolt of horror that the system was charging for a discharge. He frantically looked for an off switch or a regulator, but the controls were locked out, running an automated boot sequence initiated by the insertion of the core. The mercenaries, realizing their boat was dead, began to row frantically toward the barge, driven by professional desperation. They reached the ladder. Liam pumped the shotgun, aiming at the gunnel. The lead mercenary's head popped up, his night vision goggles glowing green. Liam fired a warning shot into the air, the boom echoing off the cliffs. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You don't know what this thing is!" The mercenary ignored him, climbing over the rail, his weapon raised. But before he could pull the trigger, the Citadel reached critical mass. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a vacuum of silence that felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Then, a pulse of pure, blue-white energy erupted from the roof of the module. It didn't blast outward like an explosion. It shot straight up, a coherent beam of light piercing the night sky, punching a hole through the cloud layer above. The shockwave of the beam's ignition knocked everyone flat, Liam, Noah, and the mercenary. The barge rocked violently. The beam wasn't just a light, it was a signal. High above the atmosphere, something answered. The console inside the Citadel began to print coordinates rapidly. Noah, picking himself up from the floor, looked at the readout. The system hadn't fired a weapon. It had established a handshake link with a satellite network that had been dormant for 40 years. Though Project Helios wasn't just the machine on the boat. The machine on the boat was the key to a constellation of satellites. And now, the owners of that network, whoever was left in the deepest shadows of the government, knew exactly where their lost property was. The mercenary on the deck scrambled to his feet, looking at the beam of light that was turning the night into day. He lowered his weapon, his face pale behind the goggles. He tapped his earpiece, but it was dead. He looked at Liam, then at the sky, and then back to the skiff. He realized this was way above his pay grade. He vaulted back over the rail, landing in the skiff and frantically paddling away. The brothers were left alone on the deck, bathed in the ethereal blue glow of the beam. The silence of the cove returned, but the sky was open. They had won the battle, but they had just announced their position to the entire world. The Iron Mule was no longer a salvage barge. It was ground zero for a geopolitical incident. Liam looked at Noah, who was standing in the doorway of the Citadel, his face illuminated by the swirling energy of the core. "What did you do?" Liam whispered. Noah looked at the sky, where the clouds were swirling around the beam like a vortex. "I think," Noah said, his voice trembling, "I just answered the phone." The beam of pure energy that erupted from the Iron Mule did not last forever, but it burned long enough to change the world for Liam and Noah. For 3 minutes, the pillar of blue-white light dominated the sky, a beacon visible for 100 miles, piercing the cloud cover and synchronizing with a dead constellation of Cold War satellites. When the capacitor banks inside the Citadel finally drained, the beam collapsed with a thunderous, imploding crack that echoed off the cliff walls like a sonic boom. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The brothers stood on the vibrating deck, their faces pale, watching the smoke drift from the overheated vents of the module. They were alive. The mercenaries had fled, but they knew their isolation was over. The game of cat and mouse was finished. The giants had been woken up. It took less than 20 minutes for the response to arrive. It didn't come in the form of black speedboats or silent assassins. It came with the overwhelming, deafening roar of authority. First, the horizon lit up with the flashing blue lights of Coast Guard cutters closing in from the north. Then, the air began to thrash as 3 heavy-lift helicopters, their rotors chopping the humid air, descended upon Black Rock Cove. These weren't the unmarked craft of the mercenaries. These were United States Navy Seahawks. Searchlights pinned the iron mule against the dark water, turning the barge into a stage. A voice on a loudspeaker boomed from the sky, ordering them to lay face down on the deck with their hands visible. The brothers complied, lying on the cold steel, feeling the wash of the rotors. They watched sideways as fast ropes dropped from the helicopters and heavily armed tactical teams descended. These soldiers moved with a different kind of precision, disciplinary and overwhelming. Within moments, the deck was secured. The brothers were zip-tied and hoisted to their feet, but they weren't treated like terrorists. They were treated like civilians who had stumbled into a nuclear silo. A man in a suit, wearing a windbreaker emblazoned with Department of Energy, fast roped down to the deck, an absurdity that highlighted the strangeness of the situation. He didn't look at the brothers. He walked straight to the citadel, pulling a Geiger counter and a complex tablet from a case. He scanned the still, warm hull of the module, checked the readings, and then tapped his earpiece, uttering a single code phrase that made the soldiers visibly relax. The brothers were separated and flown to a waiting destroyer offshore. For the next 48 hours, they were held in comfortable but locked staterooms. They were debriefed separately by intelligence officers who seemed less interested in charging them with a crime and more interested in the precise timeline of how they had activated the device. The narrative that emerged was terrifying in its scope. Project Helios was indeed a directed energy defense system from the 1980s, a Star Wars prototype that was believed to have been destroyed. The traitor in the escape pod was a defecting scientist who had tried to steal the technology for a foreign power, but the ship was scuttled by loyalist crew members to prevent the theft. The ocean had hidden the stalemate for 40 years, until 2 scrap divers looking for copper wire broke the seal. The turning point came on the 3rd day. A lawyer specializing in maritime salvage law, flown in from D.C., sat down with the brothers and a team of Navy admirals. The situation was legally complex. The brothers had valid salvage rights to the MV Meridian. They had legally purchased the hull and its contents. Technically, under maritime law, they had a claim to the citadel. However, the citadel was a classified weapon of mass destruction that civilians could not own. The government was in a bind. They couldn't confiscate it without acknowledging it existed, which would trigger international treaties and scandals. They needed a quiet, legal transfer of ownership. The negotiation was tense, but lucrative. The government couldn't pay them for a weapon, so they structured the deal differently. They classified the recovery as a specialized hazardous material remediation contract. The brothers were retroactively hired as high-level civilian contractors who had successfully located and recovered lost nuclear-adjacent assets. The copper wire they had already harvested was theirs to keep, a $1 million bonus on its own. But the real payout was for the citadel and the core. The settlement included a finder's fee, mandated by obscure maritime recovery acts, combined with a massive non-disclosure agreement settlement for their silence regarding the active capabilities of the Helios system. The final paperwork was signed in a windowless room aboard the ship. The sum was staggering, $18 $5 million USD, tax-free, deposited into an offshore trust, plus full immunity for any laws broken during the recovery, including the destruction of the mercenary drone. The Ethelgard Dynamics mercenaries, they were told, were a rogue private military company hired by the original defectors' legacy network. They had been neutralized by U.S. forces shortly after the beam fired. The threat was gone. Liam and Noah returned to shore, not as scrap dealers, but as silent titans of the industry. The Iron Mule was returned to them, cleaned and scrubbed of any evidence of the Citadel. The massive steel module was gone, cut away, and airlifted to a secret facility in the Nevada desert. The copper wire was sold openly, funding the initial expansion of their business. With the government settlement, they didn't just pay off their debts. They built an empire. They purchased a state-of-the-art salvage vessel, the RV Deep Horizon, equipped with the best ROVs and sonar systems money could buy. They rebranded their company as Meridian Recovery Solutions, a nod to the ship that changed their lives. 6 months later, the brothers stood on the deck of their new ship, watching the sunset over the Atlantic. They were dressed in crisp, new company uniforms, overseeing a crew of 20 divers working on a standard wreck. They were safe, wealthy, and successful. But in the captain's cabin, mounted in a glass display case, was the only physical memento they had kept from the adventure, the rusted, snapped bolt cutter they had used to free the core from the dead man's hand. It was a reminder that their fortune wasn't made by luck. It was made by grit, by diving into the dark when others wouldn't, and by the willingness to open the doors that were meant to stay shut. The world never knew that for 3 minutes, a forgotten weapon had turned the night sky into day. To the public, it was reported as a freak atmospheric lightning event. But Liam and Noah knew the truth. They had bought a tugboat's worth of copper and found the power of the sun. The ocean was full of ghosts, and they were the only ones brave enough, or crazy enough, to wake them up. Thank you so much for diving deep with us on this incredible journey. This story was a wild ride from the rusty deck of a barge to the edge of a global crisis. If you enjoyed this mix of history, mystery, and high-stakes action, please give this video a massive thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have even bigger, deeper mysteries coming up that you won't want to miss. And let us know in the comments. If you found a sealed military bunker at the bottom of the ocean, would you open it? Until next time, keep exploring, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the real treasure isn't gold, it's the secret next to it. See you in the next video.